And welcome in, Draft Nicks. It's time to go on the clock here at Draft Nation, draftnation.com. You know, the best way to keep up to date on everything that's happening with your favorite team or teams. And let's be honest, it's the perfect time of year because you've got NFL teams who've just pushed past the trade deadline and are headed into the second half of the season. College football teams now just a month away from conference championship games and everything that comes with that. We've got the NBA and NHL getting fired up, teams trying to figure out whether they're actually in the mix or not. A Major League Baseball offseason that should be very interesting now that the World Series has wrapped up, and so much more. And we know exactly how college football can feed into the NFL. I just mentioned both of them there. So let's bring in our guy. Covers Penn State, and of course from Draft Carolina as well, Emmet Mahon of Draft Nation here to join me today. Emmet, thanks for making the time.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. And let's keep it focused on the Nittany Lions because there's plenty to unpack, I think, after a loss to Ohio State. And for somebody that is finding this in a time capsule, years later, a digital time capsule, they'll say, oh, they're talking about the Penn State loss to Ohio State. It must be any year just about between 2017 and who knows when. And that seems to be in and of itself the crux of the matter here between the Buckeyes and the Nittany Lions is Penn State just can't seem to get over the Ohio State hump. We can talk in a little bit about the talent disparity of these two programs and the recruiting jobs of both Franklin and Day, James Franklin and Ryan Day. But let's start, I guess, specifically with this game in particular, the one at Beaver Stadium that the Nittany Lions came in. They were underdogs, even though they're the higher-ranked team coming into this game. They were the underdogs going up against the Buckeyes for many of the reasons I just outlined, right? There are talent disparities, and there is a history between these two teams, regardless of where the game is played. The biggest talking point, at least for me coming out of this one and talking to other fans after the game, I think remains the offense's inability, obviously, to punch it in when they've got two opportunities within the 5-yard line and not really getting the ball to Tyler Warren in many situations, much less those situations.
Yeah. That's absolutely the story of the game. I put on X right after that second just disastrous series that Andy Kotelnicki, the offensive coordinator, is a bit of a mad scientist and has been getting all kinds of props and love from Nittany Nation over his creativity and the having Tyler Warren snap the ball and end up catching a touchdown on the same play. And then in the most important series of the year, he reverts to 1950s Big Ten. Let's three dives up the middle type of football. It was
a series that even Joe Paterno would have thought was conservative, to be quite honest.
Truly. Yeah. I didn't look too closely at their feet, but I think for that particular series, everyone should have been in black shoes.
So this is what's interesting to me in breaking down what happened against Ohio State offensively. It seemed obvious, I think, to some of us that the offense should have come in with a game plan similar to what they had at USC, where they let Kotelnicki get into his bag of tricks early, keep that extremely talented Ohio State defense and very physical Ohio State secondary, on their toes, guessing, as it were. And we saw none of that, really, not just in those goal line series inside the 5, but at all in the offense. Very few touches for Tyler Warren. And the only thing I can come to, this is now a Penn State fan trying to cook something up in his head that makes sense. The only thing I could think of is not putting too much on tape for later in the season, because James Franklin and his coaching staff understand that even despite a loss to Ohio State, they are still a college football playoff team, as we saw in the recent rankings reveal. They would still get a home game at this point if the playoffs started tomorrow. But nonetheless, I found myself even questioning that logic, because this is your chance. This is your chance to go undefeated into a Big Ten championship game in a few weeks by beating Ohio State and maybe get the bye. Look, as much as a lot of us would love to see a playoff game at Beaver Stadium and that atmosphere in Happy Valley, I think we'd all much rather see Penn State bypass that round and go straight into the quarterfinals. So I guess aside from that line of logic, is there any reason you can possibly think of for why they approached Ohio State's defense the way that they did, and then didn't really seem to show much adjustment when they saw how the game was going to be called, or I guess not called, by the officiating crew?
The last point, I'll circle back to that, but that's really important. But I think a lot of it is the same movie we have been watching for the last 4 or 5 years. The receivers just don't get open. Yeah. So Ohio State knew that they had a couple of really good cornerbacks, and including the guy that made maybe the pivotal play of the game with the interception in the end zone. But they knew that these receivers so far, no matter whether it's scheme or ability or whatnot, just cannot get open. So that they were able to put 2-3 guys on Warren, jam them up, put pressure on Warren. At times had to be kept in, so that again, they knew that the offense goes through Warren, so they stacked it and they challenged the receivers and the backs to make a difference, and they didn't live up to the challenge. And you talk about the physical nature and the clutching and grabbing. It almost looked like Jacques Lemaire was the defensive coordinator for Ohio State with the left wing lock.
Yeah.
But like you said, so they made no adjustments, and someone on defense, they didn't take advantage of the boys let them play type of mentality.
Right.
Again, to make a quick hockey reference, it drove me nuts. Some of those bad Penguin teams that would get mugged on a nightly basis, but they wouldn't do the same thing. So, Penn State, I think it will come down to a matter of going forward. They're going to have to spend on wide receivers, but for the rest of the season, I don't know if it's they were afraid of putting things on tape. But let's face it, James Franklin does tend to play things close to the vest. I don't know if you've ever gone up to a blue-white game. It is worse than watching paint dry.
Yeah.
Because on a certain level, he is so afraid of tipping his hand on anything.
Yeah, it's a really good point that I think is something to consider when and he made this point after the game in discussing just how disappointed his players were, how disappointed the fans were over that loss, that, hey, we know we've still got everything in front of us, basically. And they do. Even if things were to fall their way, a possible trip to the Big Ten championship game, but they know that's not necessary to get to the playoff now. I did want to circle back to something that I think is worth bringing up. And you mentioned the play of Davison Igbinosun, the corner who had a huge game, had that pick in the corner of the end zone. That first time Penn State got down within the 5-yard line. That's a Jersey kid. I know he went to Ole Miss, but that's a Jersey kid. That's a kid that I think most Penn State fans look at and say, were we interested in him? If we weren't, why weren't we? And especially once he entered the portal, why were we not on top of that? Now, you could make the argument Penn State's got a very talented secondary. It's probably the position group we are least worried about, especially given the recruiting efforts of Terry Smith and everything he's done over the years. But does it feel to you, from more of a 50,000-foot view, Emmett, regardless of what position group we're talking about, that Penn State is holding up to the challenge that Ohio State has been presenting over really the last decade or so in the recruiting wars?
Well, they obviously are lacking behind Ohio State for whatever reason. I don't know if it's because Ohio State has gotten a couple national championships in this century. I don't know if it's now NIL, but they've lost a person or two from New Jersey and Pennsylvania to Ohio State. But Ohio State has decades of nationwide recruiting footprint. During the Paterno years and to a lesser extent O'Brien and the early part of Franklin, Penn State never ventured outside of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Virginia. That time, Ohio State has been pulling kids in from Florida and California for decades. I think Franklin has realized that and has gone to addressing it. They've got a couple of Florida kids coming in the 25 class, but it's still when Ohio State comes out of the tunnel with 25-star recruits and Penn State comes out of the tunnel with five-star recruits, you're at a disadvantage. Yes, James Franklin does deserve criticism for his coaching, but talent always carries the day.
Are they doing enough in the portal? I'll ask you that, Emmett, because you just scroll through the two deep and I see 3 players maybe, right? Like Nolan Rucci, who's on the offensive line, is a transfer. Jalen Kimber is a transfer on the other side of the ball in the secondary. And Julian Fleming, obviously, is at the top of that list, especially in the wake of an Ohio State game. Are they doing enough or I guess it's a two-pronged question here. Are the efforts enough in the portal? And if they are enough, are they succeeding enough because of those efforts in the portal?
Well, the on-field product tells you that they're not doing enough. And I suspect part of that is NIL. Ohio State reportedly has a $20 million NIL fund. Penn State is reportedly at $5 million. That matters these days. And again, one of the big things that James Franklin has been trying to do over his tenure is to upgrade the facilities, which they've done a magnificent job of it.
Yeah.
If you've ever had the ability to see Haluba Hall and then some of the other facilities, but they got to do better. I don't question their effort, but the results, particularly wide receiver and offensive line, I think are glaring.
I come from an age, Emmett, where the football coaches' offices were still upstairs from the ice rink. And I worked at the ice rink as a freshman. So I totally get you're right. The facilities are light years ahead of where they were 20, 25 years ago and previous to that. I guess the question then is, what do you think would get a deeper commitment from those who are able to put them on a level with the bigger programs NIL-wise? Would it have to be – this is where the expectations for James Franklin come into the fold as well. The expectations are bare minimum, now that there's a 12-team playoff, bare minimum you're in that playoff, Penn State. And from there's got to be some level of success, right? Because when we look at the bracket as it sits right now, you're talking about hosting Notre Dame. Okay, that's great. Notre Dame, wonderful defense. But you would hope that Penn State's offense would be able to outscore what Riley Leonard is doing, even though he's improved over the last few weeks. And then it's a trip, again, given the first set of rankings that were released and what the CFP would look like, a trip to a neutral site against Georgia. Okay, good luck with that. Now, there are instances, depending on how the bracket would fall, where maybe it's a game against Miami or BYU or Iowa State or Clemson, a team that Penn State could beat, especially on a neutral field. So I guess the all-encompassing question here as we talk about financial commitment from those who are able to give Penn State more and put them at least closer to that Ohio State level. Do they have to see a trip to the Final Four before they're going to be willing to push James Franklin, their financial investment in James Franklin's program, to that point?
That's a great question. I think that's true for the $5, $10, $50, $100, $250 Joe Sixpack donor to the NIL. I think the big money people, I hope that they get the big picture. The Penn State's actually in pretty good shape. But they, if they were to cut $100,000 check type of thing, that success breeds success. If they had a little more money, they'd be a little more likely to make a deep playoff run, which then would draw more donors. I suppose part of the problem that Penn State's up against is there's only so much money to be had, and they're trying to increase their NIL efforts. And to be clear to people, it's not officially a Penn State thing. The schools cannot have anything to do with the NIL funding, but they're chasing the same dollars while they're trying to fund the $700 million much needed renovation of Beaver Stadium. So there's only so many of those big checks to go around.
Right.
Is it a question of they're biting off more than they can swallow? I don't know, but clearly the NIL funding is substandard if they really do want to get to that next level and be a serious contender for the Final Four.
So let's circle back around now to the question of expectations that I mentioned. I said bare minimum. It's got to be a trip to the playoff now that it is a 12-team playoff, and you're in this, stacked Big Ten that you should be in the top tier of every single year. How have expectations, you think, adjusted since the loss last week? Because, again, James Franklin said in his post-game meeting with the media, and again early this week, that it doesn't change anything as far as what's in front of us still. They've got Washington and the whiteout this Saturday night, and then trips to Purdue and Minnesota, the second of which could be and has been in the past a little bit of a minefield, and then they wrap up at home against Maryland. If they finish 11-1, that's good enough to get into the playoff, but what will the expectations be for fans from there? Is it all dictated perhaps on how the bracket would fall?
I think it's how the bracket will fall and how they perform in that playoff game. If they host a playoff game and they lay an egg, people are going to be furious. I think if they win playoff game and, if they get whacked by Georgia, I think fans are almost realistic enough to understand losing to Georgia is no shame. Mm-hmm. Ohio State has gotten blown out in college football playoff games. So it does tend to happen. Now, I think one wild card that's not being discussed enough, and Franklin kind of hinted at it on numerous occasions, the red shirt rules are you can play 4 games without losing a year of eligibility, and postseason play no longer affects that. So Penn State has 3 games left. We might start seeing some of the freshmen, particularly at wide receiver that's underperforming. You might see someone like a Tasir Denmark get in there. You're going to see, Luke Reynolds has already played more than 4 games, but you might see some of the younger guys in there. Running back, you might get Quentin Martin some more touches, knowing that he hasn't played as many games. So that's something that Franklin, when you brought up earlier about not putting things on tape, that might be some things that he's had under wraps. But winning cures everything is the bottom line.
Yeah. Before I let you run, Emmet, it is Draft Nation, so we got to give the Draftniks a taste of those players that we've got an eye on, obviously. And this is a team that, as focused as Penn State fans have been on 2024 for good reason, that might take a step back and a pretty significant one going into 2025 if you just look at the number of names that could be headed to the NFL. We've got Drew Aller. That'll be a question after the season, obviously, depending on how this season finishes up. There will be a question. I don't know about the running backs, Singleton and Allen. But, obviously on the other side of the ball, I can't imagine Abdul Carter sticking around for another year. You've got other talents out there. Zakee Wheatley may be one who is told, hey, you're a 2nd or 3rd day draft pick and you've got a future on Sunday. So there are some key names, and those are just a few of them. Who else would you look at and say, hey, this might be their final 4 regular season games plus the playoffs with this program?
The Maryland game is going to be very interesting because that's senior day, and it'll
Mhm.
be interesting to see who comes out of the tunnel to greet their parents. You're absolutely, Carter is gone. KJ Winston, even though he's been banged up, I think he's out of there. Tyler Warren has to go because he's out of eligibility.
Right.
The running backs will be a big question. They'll never say it publicly, but I think James Franklin, Andy Kotelnicki, Jawan Sider wouldn't mind if, pardon me, if one of the guys, one of Singleton or Allen left, because they have so many running backs either in the room or will be coming on campus in the next year or two. I don't know. And again, a lot of it depends on NIL. Nowadays, if you're going to be fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh rounder priority free agent, it might be financially and long-term beneficial for you to come back, put another season on tape, improve your draft stock while putting a couple $100,000 or $1 million in your pocket.
Yeah.
I think for me, the big question mark is going to be deny Dennis Sutton, who I think the world of. I think he's just an amazing talent. He's been dinged up the last couple of games. He's going to be a big one that what the advisory committee comes back and talks about. I could see him leaving, but I could also see him looking at some of his former teammates that came back for an extra year and made themselves a little bit more money and found themselves in better positions by coming back and using all of their eligibility. But again, they're deep enough, and they've got a really good incoming class, and the 26th class looks to be even better. That I don't think there's a program killer that if they decide to walk, that they can survive it. It'll be interesting next year. Everyone talks about Nick Dawkins. He's a senior. He's out. But they talk about how important he is to the continuity of the line.
Yeah.
And so this next year will be the third year in a row where you have an offensive line with a new center. So that'll be interesting.
What's your gut instinct on Aller? I mean, I would think another year, especially with, as you mentioned and alluded to, a significant NIL deal would be enough to convince him to come back and refine some things even more, because he was a name that was mentioned on the very outskirts, the exurbs, if you will, of the Heisman conversation this past summer. But we've seen him. He hasn't played down to any level, I don't think. I think he's been good to very good at times, but we've seen that he maybe another year with Kotelnicki unlocks some things and really cements his prospects for Sundays if he were to come back for a final year.
It's a tough question because this year's quarterback class isn't great. It's absolutely nothing like last year. I mean, you pretty much have two locks in the first round in Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. After that, it's kind of a mixed bag. There is a chance because it's the NFL and they operate under, I must have a quarterback, I must have a quarterback, I must have a quarterback. And as a fan of the New York Giants, I can tell you how lethal that mindset can be because when they overdrafted Daniel Jones, quarterback.
Oh, I think we may have lost Emmet, unfortunately. And he was just getting going on what was a very, very interesting point about quarterbacks and how that may or may not affect Drew Aller's decision to come out in the draft this next offseason. But worth keeping an eye on what happens with Aller. And also, there's one other thing. We'll have to kick this can down the road a little bit the next time we talk to Emmet. But an interesting question about those running backs. He mentioned the idea of Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, at least one of them perhaps, moving on. That would open the door certainly for Quentin Martin, who folks from Western PA recognize that name, to become a more significant part of the mix going forward. And that, I know, again, a lot of people in Western PA would be very interested in. I think we got Emmet back, so I'm going to bring him back in here for just 1 second. Sorry, Emmet, we lost you for just a moment there. You're making a really good point about the NFL and their desire to have a quarterback at all costs and what it's done to the New York Giants over the last several years. It's a really good point. NFL teams are desperate for quarterbacks. Maybe that encourages someone to bring Drew Aller or to over project where Drew Aller may go if that opportunity exists for him. I mentioned while you were away for a second, one last thing I wanted to circle back to, because you mentioned the running backs, Allen and Singleton, and whether one of them may end up deciding to move on after this year. For a lot of folks in Western PA and PA high school football fans, that would open the door for a guy whose name they've heard for a few years now in Quentin Martin. In the running back room. Is that a name just that you've heard kicked around at all around the program as they've started to think about the future? Oh, we got Emmett's video, but we didn't get his audio. So I'm going to once again thank Emmet Mahon for joining us from Draft Nation and Draft Carolina as well. He's doing a great job covering everything going on down there. But questions about the Penn State program, they've got to put a punctuation mark on the end of this season with the whiteout against Washington, with those 2 road games against Purdue and Minnesota. Then obviously, as Emmet mentioned, senior day against Maryland before they head off to the college football playoff and try to win at least one, if not multiple games there as well. Draftniks, you know, you can always get the best, most latest up-to-date information on what's happening with your favorite teams at draftnation.com. Go there today and create an account for free. Thanks again to Emmet Mahon for going on the clock with us. I'm Chris Mack. This has been Draft Nation.